Greetings, all. Professor Kyle here. This is my show, D&Disability, and a good friend of mine, Brad, and I are here to dive in and really show you what made the West, as in to say the rise of the Indus Valley and more. Answer the questions: what is civilization? How would you define it? And really, how does it differ from culture or society? When studying history, particularly ancient history or prehistory, we have no written sources. We rely almost entirely on material culture and artifacts up to a certain point. We have the early hominins beginning about roughly 2 million years ago with the Paleolithic era to the Stone Age, about 11,000 BCE. These are predominantly hunter-gatherer peoples who are nomadic simply as a necessity.
We have Neanderthalers flourishing about 200,000 years ago. The use of speech, ritualized burials, and the use of jewelry, kindling, and control of fire about 164,000 years ago. Interbreeding with Homo sapiens 60,000 years ago. And the extinction roughly 40,000 years ago.
So this brings us up to the Homo sapiens, who have more effective tools than other early hominids did. They have fish hooks, arrowheads, sewing needles, etc. They would make things out of not just wood, but also antler, bone, even copper. We have cave paintings at Lascaux and Chevet in France. They're about some 30,000 years old. We even have signs of flourishing. As an example, paints, musical instruments, decorative items such as beads, even grave rituals, some kind of religious observation perhaps, but there is debate. Here I'm showing you the cave paintings from Lascaux, and these date somewhere between 10 to 15,000 BCE. It's really hard to date these kinds of things, but we see several different species of animals, and they're hunted by people up through the Ice Age. The largest animal depicted here is a species of longhorned cattle known as the aurochs, which is now extinct. Now, whether this painting is an act of, say, sympathetic magic, where you're trying to engage with these hunters and hopefully some of their success will rub off on you, or whether this is simply a map to say where the aurochs are, we never will know. But there's a bit about Lascaux for you.
Now, the Neolithic Revolution begins about 11,000 BCE. The communities become more stable and human interactions more complex. We have the domestication of animals, the cultivation of plants, the emergence of towns and villages. As an example, 7,500 to 5,700 BCE, Catalhoyuk flourishes. 6,800 to 3,000 BCE, Jericho flourishes.
And with the rise of agriculture, of course, comes disease. Humans begin to live with animals, cut down trees. Vectors, such as insects, bring new diseases like malaria. Moving on to Jericho, though. When we have Jericho, what can we think of when we think of these first cities? Well, we have a seasonal grain-producing settlement with a massive building program, which dates to a little later, the walls and towers. We have some 3,000 inhabitants, perhaps. We have pottery used for storage, but as well as for cooking. We have the brewing of beer. Remember, beer is central to their diet. They would think of beer, and Mesopotamians indeed would think of beer the same way we would think of fine wine. It's what makes us human. We have this identifiable pottery styles and differing styles throughout a period, which helps archaeologists kind of stratify the history of Jericho. And when we think about ancient sources prior to writing, this is really the kind of material culture we're looking at.
It began as a settlement from 8,000 to 9,000 BCE. At its height, it included walls, an outer ditch, and a tower. Developments of the period the shifting of humanity to a sedentary communal lifestyle, and related transition to new subsistence economies, as well as changes in social organization and the development of religious practices, testified by skulls and statues found.
We have Catalhoyuk, which dates to some 7 to 9,000 years ago, south-central Turkey today. This is a city of perhaps 8,000 who lived somewhere in about 2,000 homes, and they had an organized and technologically sophisticated society with religious rites, burial of the dead. They have domesticated plants and animals, and there seems, at least from what we can glean, very little division of labor at this point. There was no hegemonic domination by the patriarchy for those feminist historians among you. Here we have an image, the growth of agriculture. Take a look at the chronology of the agriculture's development here. What areas began cultivating crops first, and why? In what period did agriculture spread the most rapidly, and more importantly, why? Think about this. How might rivers have played a critical role in the spread of farming and technologies? I'm not going to go into the answers here, but just let that float in the back of your mind.
We also have the development of long distance trade, luxury goods, as an example, marine shells and semi precious stones, such as turquoise and lapis lazuli, accelerated chain exchange of ideas, social stratification as a result of access to high prestige goods, the making of pottery and cloth, manufacturing of weapons and tools.
Here we have the impact of stored agricultural surplus. You get all of this long distance trade by stockpiling wealth. It also begins tying people to specific communities. We have more stratified communities now. Finally, a concept of rich and poor. But trade at this point is an exchange of commodities. The accelerated exchange of commodities would also bring new ideas. Sometimes you're not just trading beads for, say, barley, right? You are trading the idea of, well, here, let me teach you how to make fish traps, and I will get some of your barley. But in addition to that, we have an increased social stratification. Priests at this point are largely the ones hoarding grain to be redistributed to the rest of the community, as an example. We have the beginnings with those priests of the social elites.
By 1900 BCE, a nomadic people called the Assyrians had become caravan merchants whose extensive trade networks stretched across Anatolia and Mesopotamia. They did not seek military dominance over the region. Instead, they relied on the protection of local rulers and, in turn, made those rulers rich. They also served as advisors and officials. They married into important urban families. In the process, they carried Mesopotamian civilization and its trappings into far-flung regions of the world.
Remember, when we're talking about Mesopotamia here, guys, we're talking about a collection of really city-states.
This is where sites such as Göbekli Tepe and an early historic or Neolithic ritual site, older than Stonehenge by at least 5,000 years, the massive stone pillars that still rise in southeastern Anatolia, which is Turkey, are the remains of multiple circular structures built on a rocky hilltop far from sources of water or any known settlement. It is thought to have been a sacred site and a meeting place for nomadic peoples. It could have been a trading hub, but it lacks any natural source of water.
We have the early Ubaid cities here, dating to around 5900 BCE foundation. They, of course, are founded in the beginnings of the Tigris Euphrates rivers. They used irrigation, mostly dikes and levees, to control the temperamental waters and achieve a surplus of really farming products. This surplus would lead to the support of non-farming specializations. They would have enough success to have shrines built out of mud brick and generate much larger urban settlements. But
The growth of Uruk, which is between 4300 and 2900 BCE, we have larger temple complexes. As an example, the White Temple, an increase of grain and cloth production, expansion of trade routes, domination by a priestly class.
And to the peoples of the ancient world, the benefits of civilization are stability, government, art, writing, and also technology. And they're the products of a sedentary city life. The very word civilization derives from the Latin word civis, or city. Cities, however, become possible only as a result of innovations that begin around the end of the last ice age, about 13,000 years ago, that come to formation about some 8,000 years later. The history of civilization is therefore a surprisingly short one. Within the study of humanity, which reaches back to the genus Homo in Africa some 1.7 million years ago, it's really just a blip on the radar screen of our history as humans.
The White Temple at Uruk, roughly 3400 BCE. Now, this temple may have been dedicated to the sky god An, or designated to provide all of the region's gods with a mountaintop home in a place of the world known for its level plains.
Now, give the White Temple a break, guys, keeping in mind it is some 5,500 years old. Just imagine how you would look in 5,500 years, okay? But that aside, we have the development of pictograms used for a physical object. They could also convey an idea associated with said object. Earlier forms of writing may have included the arrangement of real world items, three-dimensional objects in space conveying different meanings. Pictograms are far more permanent way of doing so. We have phonemes, that is to say, the pictograms associated with particular spoken sounds.
Now, a pictograph would be a picture that represents words or ideas. By 3100 BCE, Sumerian scribes also developed a specialized tool suited to the task of writing, a durable stylus made of reed. Because this stylus leaves an impression shaped like a wedge, it is indeed cut as a wedge on one side, and it has a blunted tip on the other side, so both sides could be used. This script is called cuneiform from the Latin cuneus. With it, cuneiform symbols could be impressed more quickly into clay, but because the new stylus was not suited to drawing pictograms that accurately represented things, the symbols became more abstract. Eventually, they barely resembled the original pictograms at all. Meanwhile, symbols were invented for every possible phonetic combination in the Sumerian language, reducing the number of necessary pictograms from about 1200 to 600. Whereas the earliest pictograms could have been written and read by anyone, writing and reading now became a specialized, powerful skill accessible only to a small and influential minority taught in designated scribal schools.
Anyway, so with this cuneiform, which we see here, the image on the left showing a Sumerian clay tablet from about 3000 BCE, the standardized pictures are beginning to represent concepts as well as things. Notice the symbol Ninda here, meaning food, at the top. On the right, we have carvings in limestone from about 2600 BCE, which reveal the evolution of cuneiform into its more abstract form. Consider this. Why would such abstract pictograms have been easier to reproduce quickly from the earlier, more realistic images?
Civilization of Sumer, we could start with Sumerian cities. They shared a common culture and a language. They competed with each other for resources and labor, and they often waged war against each other. Their economic activity normally would occur at temple warehouses where goods were stored and redistributed. The production of the textiles at those temple warehouses, which would employ thousands of enslaved people, mostly women and children. The temple elites were the buyers and sellers of goods.
And let's turn our attention to Sumerian hierarchies. During the Uruk period, the Sumerians identified their gods with the forces of the natural world. We have the early dynastic period, which may come to imagine their gods as resembling the Lugals, these war leaders who exploited the city's wealth for their own glory. While they mean big men, they would now rule over their cities and replace the priesthood. When we think about the birth of the Lugal, it sometimes can come down to, quite simply, the man with the pointy stick is far harder to overthrow than the priest in the Pope hat. But being glib aside, we have the reciprocity in Sumerian religion. Humans give goods, food, luxury items, clothes, that kind of thing, to the gods, and the gods sometimes give humans gifts in return. It's purely contractual. Some Lugals would claim to be the representation of gods on Earth, but this would become precarious, as if, say, the Tigris or Euphrates decide to flood, or worse, not flood, and everybody is starving to death or dying of famine, and you claim that you're God's favorite, well, all of a sudden, you don't look like God's favorite anymore.
Now let's look at the Fertile Crescent. Now you'll notice the proximity of Sumerian cities to rivers. Consider the vital role played by the Tigris and the Euphrates in shaping the Mesopotamian civilizations. How many Sumerian cities can you identify on the map? Why might Sumerian cities have been clustered so closely together? And what challenges and opportunities did this represent?
Now, up to this point, we have not really spoken much about Bronze Age technology, so let's get into that, because the Sumerians were masters of it. They would use copper, which they would then alloy with first arsenic and then later tin to produce bronze. Fun fact, you can also alloy copper with things like aluminum to produce bronze today. And bronze is easily poured into molds and maintained its rigidity and shape far better. It can also be work hardened by hammering. But bronze aside, we have the invention of the potter's wheel used to create high quality clay vessels, no more coil and slab method. We have carts and war chariots, which are used for both haulage and war. Remember, horses at this point in time are too small to ride. They're only really good as really dragging or hauling animals. We have the invention of the seed drill, something that will last for almost the next 1,000 years and then eventually fall out of fashion. We have the use of measuring and surveying equipment, as well as a lunar calendar for reckoning time. All of these devices would come together to make them masters of map making, surveying, as well as the ability to predict floods, track seasons, and ultimately explain the prosperity of the Sumerians, not just as military leaders or traders, but finally as a combination thereof.
Now, this would be an exemplar of the Sumerian war chariot, the earliest known representation of the wheel dating about 2600 BCE, and it shows how wheels were fashioned from slabs of wood.
And if you've seen old medieval movies that have slab-sided wheels on, say, trebuchets or something like that, let alone carts, just note that they're depicting something from, I don't know, about 4,500 years ago, and not something that the medieval period would use, as those would quite quickly go the way of the dodo bird. Here we have a Sumerian plow with a seed drill as an example. Seed drills control the distribution of seed to ensure that it falls directly into the farrow made by the plow. By contrast, the method of sowing seed which would be practiced elsewhere in the world and as late as the 19th century in Europe and the Americas, was to simply broadcast the seed by throwing it out in handfuls. The Sumerian style plows were developed during the 3rd millennium BCE and were still being used by the 7th century BCE. When this black stone tablet, of course, the one you're seeing here, is engraved. Let's ask ourselves, let's think about what you've learned about the Sumerians and their environment. Why would they have developed this technology? I can tell you here the advantage of the seed drill is one that probably shouldn't have been forgotten, but that's the way life goes. So, as we wrap up this first presentation, let's look forward. We have the first empires. We have the invasion of Akkad. The Sumerians, up to that point, would remain a collection of independent and mutually hostile city-states, kind of like what we'll get to when we get to the Greeks. We have Sargon in the Akkadian realm, 2350 to 2160 BCE. We have the installation of the Akkadian-speaking governors in the cities to manage control, finally the birth of bureaucracy. We have the collection of tribute and imposed centralized authority. Let's hear it for taxes, guys. And after the death of Sargon's son and heir, Naram-Sin, we have Akkadian rule in the region effectively dissolving and all falls apart. Like so many good dictatorships, it doesn't last very long. But what does this leave us? Well, it leaves us with a fusion of Akkadian and Sumerian divinities. The Akkadian Ishtar becomes the Sumerian goddess Inanna, as an example. But more on that next time. As always, if you enjoy this content, please like, share, subscribe, do all that fun stuff.